for coming out tonight. We're very excited to have Dr. Hampson, who's from our department here at St. Andrews. It's her first time at PhilSoc, so welcome. She's a lecturer in ancient philosophy, and she did her undergrad at Cambridge and her master's and PhD at UCL. And her interests include ancient philosophy with a particular focus on ancient ethics, and also moral psychology, particularly Aristotle's Ethics and Plato. Today's talk is entitled The Tyrant and the Failure of Philia, and the topic comes, as I have understood, from a conference which was hosted in Edinburgh in November 2019.
The before times.
Right. By Professor McCabe?
Yeah, Emma McCabe.
Emma McCabe, and it was on rereading Plato's Republic. So, yeah, without further ado, Professor.
Thank you very much. Sorry for that fact. This is thank you so much for having me here, for the organisers. Genuinely kind of delighted to be here. This is my first talk, for PhilSoc, but it's also my first talk IRL. Since the before time. So it's actually like it's a bit weird seeing like 3D and definitely like more freaked out than you'd normally be. So you've kind of given me the introduction that I was going to give to the talk, which is this has kind of come out of a project on rereading the Republic. So one of the most famous works in the history of philosophy. What more can we say? And this project of Emma McCabe's is kind of what happens when she had a 10-year project where a group of academics read the Republic in the Greek, one book a year for 10 years. I got to be part of that as the kind of towards the end of it as a graduate student, and then a couple of years later, all of these members of this project came together in Edinburgh, in kind of the end of the before times, to have this conference on rereading the Republic. And there's going to be a volume that comes out sometime. So this is going to be a contribution to that, which hopefully kind of tells you a bit about what I'm trying to do in this paper. At this conference, there was a Kaylee, it was touching and like sweat, and it was like it'd be a super spreader event now. So as I say, I'm kind of really delighted to be here doing this in front of a home crowd. So yeah, because the technology has failed, I'm going to be doing this semi-manually between my St. Andrews account, which has just failed to cooperate, at my own laptop. So let's hope that this doesn't end up too out of sync. Let me kind of begin with a conclusion. And this is the conclusion to the account of the tyrannical character of Plato's Republic that comes in Book 9. And this conclusion is immediately before the interlocutors go on to make the kind of judgment about the tyrant's life. So the tyrant is, if kind of just to refresh your memory of the Republic, we have the just man, who's kind of characterized by the harmony of the soul, reason rules, spirit and appetite, kind of obey reason, and he also doesn't commit any injustice. But this picture of the kind of the just man's kind of harmonious soul is meant to be, this is the health of the soul, and so this is why it's qua healthy. This is why it's a kind of a state that's worth choosing in itself. And so the tyrannical character, he's kind of loomed large over the Republic. He's been kind of hinted at in Book 1. Thrasymachus says, doesn't the tyrant lead like the best life? Isn't he the happiest? And this account comes right at the end, and he's kind of, in a sense, that the counterpart to the just man, and they're going to show that his life is the most wretched. So to read this conclusion, see which screen can I read the best? This is tiny. It's like the Goldilocks: too big, too small, just right to the side. So here we go. So they say we'll attribute also to this man what we mentioned before, namely that he is necessarily envious, untrustworthy, unjust, friendless, so aphilos, impious, host and nurse to every kind of vice, and that his ruling makes him more so. And because of all of these, he's extremely unfortunate, and he goes on to make those near him like himself. So this it's just wonderful writing. This is why Plato is just such a brilliant writer. What a kind of wonderful description of this kind of tyrannical soul. So in terms of the scholarship kind of accounts of the tyrannical character, they often tend to focus, I suppose, on what we might call the moral psychology of the tyrant. And particularly there's a focus on the kind of structure of his soul and the kind of the nature of his characteristic desires. In the course of this account, we're told, if any of you have kind of read it recently, this story where he seems to be at the mercy of these unruly appetites that he has. He's under the direction of a certain sort of eros, a certain erotic desire. And for that reason, he's often compared in the scholarship to something like an addict with an unmanaged addiction. So if the virtuous person, if that's the kind of the health of the soul, then the tyrannical character, this is meant to be the kind of pathological case, right? And then people say, well, what's the relevant pathology? It's, maybe something like an addict who's kind of tyrannized by his own desires. I don't want to deny that, at least some of that is there in the account, but I think it's really, really striking that all of these qualities mentioned here are specifically interpersonal qualities. Even piety, right, might be not your relation to others, but it's your relations to the gods, and there are links in kind of Plato between piety and other kind of interpersonal relations. I think it's just so striking that when they conclude the account, that all of these are interpersonal qualities, and obviously one striking quality is that the tyrant is necessarily friendless. And so this is going to be the focus of this talk. I realise I have absolutely no idea what time we started because I was faffing, but hopefully we won't overrun too much. I really thank you to do that, don't I? So I just want to say something at the outset about this Greek word that I've translated here as friendless. So this word aphilos. So it's composed of the Greek word for friend, philos, and a privative a. So two things. One, just to kind of flag for the talk that the Greek word kind of philos and philia, so friend, friendship, have a kind of wider semantic range than the English words kind of friend and friendship. So of course, what is a friend? What is friendship? Philosophical questions. But if we have a kind of sense of what we mean by that, the kind of the sense of the Greek word kind of picks out more relationships than we might think of as kind of friendship relationships. So various kind of family relationships would fall under the kind of umbrella of philia. So again, it's generally got a kind of positive connotation as well. So I just wanted to kind of flag that. But we might also think that this word friendless in English suggests something kind of numerical, as it were. So it's a thought we're just talking about the sheer number of friends that the tyrant has. He's got 0 friends. He's a loner. And then we might kind of think, well, that's obvious, right? I mean, he's a tyrant, so of course he's got no friends. So in this account, the tyrant he steals, he deceives, and so he's just a complete jerk, right? So who wants to be friends with someone like that? But I think that this isn't what Plato has in mind, or it's not all that he has in mind when he describes the tyrant as necessarily aphilos. And there's kind of a couple of reasons for that. So, for one, kind of flags, I take it that doesn't tell us anything essential about the tyrant. So if the thought is that something like, well, the tyrant's unjust behaviour, stealing, deceiving, is necessarily going to kind of alienate other people, it's going to produce loads of enemies, he's not going to have any friends, well, that seems like it would be true of the just man with a reputation, an undeserved reputation for injustice as well, right? He's going to be aphilos in that sense. So it doesn't feel like that really tells us anything essential about the tyrant. And, relatedly, I took it in that first quotation I gave you, what we had there are a list of character traits, right? So this kind of numerical sense of being friendless, just kind of having, do I have one friend, many friends, or the limit case 0 friends. That doesn't really seem to pick out a character trait. And I think that this is confirmed. Actually, many passages, so in a longer version of this, I'd then go and quote a whole lot of ways in which I think he kind of fails to be, there's something much deeper about his character. But I'm just going to give you this one for the sake of the talk. So another passage I'm going to read out loud because I think it's just so brilliant, such a wonderful description of an awful person. So now they say, so this is one of the kind of first conclusions they draw about the tyrant. And they say, now in private life, before a tyrannical man attains power, isn't he this sort of person, so a character trait? One who associates primarily with flatterers, who are ready to obey him in everything. Or if he happens to need anything from other people, isn't he willing to fawn on them and make every gesture of friendship, as if he were dealing with his own family? But once he gets what he wants, don't they become strangers again? So someone with a tyrannical nature lives his whole life without being friends with anyone. Always a master to one man or a slave to another, never getting a taste of either freedom or true friendship. So again, if I want to kind of motivate the idea that this is a real essential feature of this character type, and it's surely got to be more than the thought that because he behaves like a tyrant, no one wants to be friends with him. There seems to be really, something seems to have gone really wrong with, it looks like, his interpersonal relations, the way that he relates to other people, right? And it seems that this is part of what makes his life so wretched as well. In that conclusion, we have those character traits, the first one, and then they say because of this, he's miserable. So I take it that this is kind of telling us something important about human flourishing and its opposite. So, well, this is the one I need to press, isn't it? I'm saying that this is, I think, an essential feature of the tyrant. I think it's something that doesn't get enough attention in the scholarly literature. I think it's there, jumping out of the page. So, we want to, if we think this is part of what's wrong with the tyrant, this is part of his, his pathology, what makes his condition pathological, how should we understand this? What explains this failure, we might be asking. And I take it there's a kind of a natural temptation at this point to try to explain this feature of the tyrannical character by appeal to some other defining feature, and more specifically to his characteristic desires. And I say that this temptation is natural. I take it because prior to this, we've had this kind of account of degenerate kind of cities, degenerate souls, where it looks like we have the characteristic desires described in each case, and these seem to, it looks like, play some role in kind of explaining the kind of city or soul state that's described. So then we might think, well, there's a lot of disagreement in the scholarship about the tyrant's characteristic desires, so both about what desires characterize the tyrant and about how we should characterize those desires. But we might think in terms of the approach, well, once we go and settle that issue, then our task is actually relatively simple, right? So we want to kind of explain why, for example, if you have those kinds of desires, that's either necessarily going to produce the behaviour that's kind of in conflict with the norms of Philia or something, or maybe more fundamentally, why, and I'm quoting a kind of recent scholar we'll come to, it's structurally impossible for someone with those kinds of desires to have friends. And actually, having said that this kind of interpersonal, these interpersonal qualities of the tyrant aren't often the kind of focus of scholarship, it's much more on his desires. We might think that actually a lot of the kind of the scholarship that exists on his desires, that in there is a kind of a wealth of accounts that we could appeal, like kind of wealth of material, so where we could appeal to generate the kind of account that we want of why the tyrant is the way he is. Just to kind of flag a few of those options, various scholars have, so some kind of trace his antisocial tendencies to his unnecessary appetites. intensity and insatiability. So the tyrant, this is the kind of sense in which the tyrant is often kind of likened to, let's say, an addict with an unmanaged addiction. So he's kind of just subject to these appetites, they're insatiable, he needs to get more and more to satisfy them, and then he's going to engage in this antisocial behaviour as a result of that. Or some other scholars, they kind of add this thought that, so the tyrant has got this implanted, a certain eros is implanted in him, and some suggested that this kind of species of desire is one that's inherently asocial. So I'm quoting Dominic Scott here, and he says, it has a peculiar intensity that transforms the subject's attitudes to other concerns, in this case blinding him to the importance of social norms and boundaries. Others have suggested that he's got these lawless desires, that's somewhere in the account. The thought is, again, that these are the kinds of desires that are just simply, by nature, inherently destructive of kind of social relations or something like that. Or again, most recently, Karen Nielsen, who's at Oxford, she has a really wonderful paper on the tyrant, where she's drawn a kind of more explicit connection between his desires and his status as friendless. And so she says, let me find this, yeah. So friendship requires reciprocity and equality, two values that the tyrant is loath to recognise. He can only succeed if someone else fails, for what he wants is supremacy as private individual, and he promotes his own private interest, which he sees as in competition with the interests of everyone else. So, this is a theory of mind, I don't want to deny that at least some of these accounts are kind of give plausible accounts of why someone with those kinds of desires might necessarily be friendless, etc., etc. I think some are more plausible than others, so I'm very sympathetic to kind of Karen Nielsen's explanation. Some of the stuff about eros, I think, just kind of misses the nature of that. But I do want to kind of question at least the sufficiency of these accounts. This account, I'm going to call that the kind of synchronic approach. And so I take it, in this kind of approach, we're taking a kind of a time slice of the tyrant. And a time slice particularly in his mature constitution. And then we're kind of attempting to explain one feature. So we take this time slice, and we attempt to explain one feature of the tyrant in this time slice by appeal to another. So one worry I have about this is that by looking just simply at a time slice, we have this really restricted view of the tyrannical character, right? We're just focused on one time slice, we're just focused especially on his mature constitution. And I worry that that restricted view kind of eclipses the insights that we might get if we look diachronically, if we look at how the tyrant has developed over time. So if we want to know why he is the way he is, it seems that we've got a kind of very limited answer, at least if we just look at one time slice. Surely we want to kind of look over time, surely we want to have a kind of diachronic approach. And the other, maybe the kind of, the meteor worry, is that this kind of purely synchronic approach, I think also risks making an unwarranted assumption about the kind of causal and explanatory relations between these features of the tyrannical character. Okay, so I take it as far as this approach goes, we're kind of assuming we've got this time slice and that some features of this are causes, his desires, and some are effects, his kind of status as aphilos. But I take it that just, taking a step back, at least the possibilities, right, the conceptual space, that it's possible at least that the causal relation is the other way around, or that both of these phenomena have a common cause, or that the causal relation is more complicated still. So I take it that we can't know this, and we shouldn't kind of rule out these alternative explanations until we've looked at the tyrant's developmental history and kind of how that's unfolded. So, it might be the case that we find out that the tyrant has kind of simply developed these bad desires of some sort, whether kind of unruly appetites or lawless desire, whichever kind of characteristic you want to go with the result that he's friendless in maturity. But, you know, it might also be the case that, for example, the tyrant has failed to develop friendships and kind of good interpersonal relations, and that this feature of his developmental history is what explains his kind of failure in maturity, and maybe other features of the tyrant as well. So, kind of press on and try to speed up a bit, although I know we're slightly behind. So then the question is, you know, where do we look then? I'm saying we should take a I'm saying we shouldn't take a synchronic approach, or not kind of start there, we should take a kind of diachronic approach. So where do we find the developmental history of the tyrant? So in book 9 there's an account of the tyrant's genesis. There's this kind of allegorical story of how eros is implanted in his soul, becomes leader of his lawless desires. And there's also a kind of longer account of the degeneration process that runs right from the start of book 8 through to book 9. So we might also think of that as telling us this kind of wider, like kind of longer developmental story. And again, in terms of standard readings of the Republic, I take it these books are kind of often thought to tell a story about how bad desires are developed, and the kind of influences on this process. And it kind of culminates in the lawless desires of the tyrant. But I want to suggest that we can actually gain a deeper insight into the tyrant's developmental history. If we read this account, so not just book 9, but book 8, this longer account, alongside and in contrast to the account of education and nurture of the guardians of the ideal city that runs from kind of book 2 at least until book 5, and maybe continues onwards, but I'm not going to tell the whole story of the Republic. Because I think that in this account of education and nurture, we can kind of read these books as telling us not simply about education and nurture, but as telling a kind of normative story of human development. So in the good case, that then we see mirrored in the negative in the account of degeneration. So we have kind of one like developmental story, the good case in the early books, and then we've got the kind of narrative of decline. So I think there's a mirroring, and I'm going to draw your attention to some features of that. So what I'm kind of interested in, if we look to these early books, is the kind of developmental narrative that Plato chooses to tell in these books. And so I think that whatever, I'm interested in what these books reveal about the kind of the nature and the structure of the developmental process in the ideal city, and then what that kind of tells us about the corresponding developmental history of the tyrant. So I take it a kind of, again, a preoccupation, sorry, that's not you can see this, with the psychology of the just person. In book 4 kind of encourages this view again that the early books are about just kind of establishing virtue in the soul, and it's about kind of how we can develop good desires. But I think when we kind of return to these books, having read The Tyrant, that at least one, something kind of jumps out at us, that one purpose of the education program, at least one very kind of pronounced one, the way that this is introduced, is to instill philia among citizens. So I was kind of going to quote some stuff at you, but I'm just going to ask you to take me at my word here for the kind of sake of keeping me to time. So I think this is the way in which education is introduced, and that we then see in the developmental in the kind of account of education this kind of, it's got this distinctly social slant, and this kind of emphasis on philia and friendship really kind of punctuates this narrative. And I think we see this especially in the content of the Guardian's education, where the initial focus in particular is interpersonal. So the Republic, it puts so much emphasis throughout the Republic on the importance of beginnings and how beginnings kind of really determine what follows. And so I think it's really significant that Plato, when he tells the account of the education of the Guardians and the kind of stories that you should hear from childhood, that he begins with stories that have this distinctly interpersonal focus. So kind of very famously, these old Homeric stories of like warring families are not allowed in the ideal city. And the idea is that the young guardians won't be, they'll think it's shameful, if they hate each other, and so on. They say, these opinions that you absorb at this age are hard to erase, they're apt to become unalterable, so the importance of kind of habituation from an early age. And the result of this is described at the start of book 3. They say that the young guardians won't take their friendships lightly. So again, this is one of the moments I think that really kind of punctuates this account. And again, as the account continues, when at the end of book 3 we come to the selection of guardians, we're told one of the features of those selected is that they love and care for the city. And have I got the, sorry, it's hard to keep these two things in line, so no, I can't find the quotation here. But anyway, they kind of, Plato expands on, what it is to love something, and they say when you love something, you think that the same things are advantageous to it as to yourself, etc. So this is one of the kind of qualities that the guardians have. So what I'm suggesting is here, when we look at the account of education, if we kind of read these books, kind of a couple of books very closely, that we have one of the explicit aims is to promote philia between citizens. The focus of these, especially in the all-important beginning that Plato emphasizes again and again, is interpersonal, on developing the right kind of interpersonal attitudes. And actually, when we come to book 4, he has the interlocutors kind of, there's a moment where they pause and they warn about the changes to anything in the, if we make any changes to this education program, the results are going to be catastrophic, so you must leave things as they've described them. So, I take it that this account, in the early narrative, this account of musical education, it doesn't tell the full story of the guardian's development. And actually this becomes clear, I think, when we come to book 5. And there's this moment where Plato has the interlocutors kind of interrupt Socrates, so it's really, really pronounced. And they'd say, come on, hang on, you said all of this stuff earlier about kind of communal living, you owe us a story, what's going on here? So I take it that I suppose, as I read it then, book 5, we've got this account famously of community here, and then there's all this stuff about philosopher rulers. But there's a way in which we can read this as kind of continuous with the developmental narrative. I think there are lots of kind of these textual points that make us think that this is a continuation of that story. But importantly here, what we get is, it seems not so much a focus on the content of education, but on the conditions of nurture. And again, I take it to be significant that this kind of account of the nurture of the guardians of the ideal city is embedded in this account of community, communal living, and then this focus on their kind of communal upbringing. So famously, the ideal city of the Republic is organised so that everything is in common, full living arrangement, and also wives and children. And this is to accord with the principle that everything is common amongst friends. So again, this kind of focus on friendship and the interpersonal. And in the course of this narrative, it looks at the account of the guardians' nurture. What seems to be really distinctive again is this focus on community, on shared activity, shared experiences. They live together, they eat together, they do everything together. So you might think, what does this suggest? Well, it kind of, in one sense, this would be kind of a topic for a bigger occasion, but it looks like this kind of pointing to the idea that these are opportunities to form, to cooperate, to form, to enjoy shared experiences, to kind of form joint goals, etc., and to develop, in a sense, those, the kind of mutuality that is, a feature of kind of friendships and good interpersonal relationships. And maybe these are also the conditions in which friendships are formed, right? When you engage in joint activities, when you form joint goals, and so on. So So I take it that if we read the earlier developmental narrative as telling something about the importance of instilling the right kind of attitudes towards other people, that kind of good early habituation in that sense, then this kind of second part of the developmental narrative, in the good case, tells us something about the very conditions in which friendships and good interpersonal relationships are themselves developed. So I think it's a really kind of sophisticated narrative actually that we've got there, that when you've kind of read the Tyrant stuff and you come back to it, maybe stands out more on the second reading. And I think that actually the result of this first developmental narrative is part of the result. Again, I'm not talking about the philosopher rulers and the cave and so on. But this is shown in the image of Callipolis, of the ideal city, as a community of friends. And again, I take it that this account that we get in book 5, there are loads of motifs that, say, in a long version, if we had the paper, I'd bore you to death by showing you all of these motifs that kind of link this up. But I think these show that the account of kind of friendship that's painted here is very much linked with the earlier developmental account, that kind of suggests that this is the result of this process. So we have the guardians. They regard one another as kinfolk. They call each other brother, mother, sister, etc. So I said that Philia has that wider semantic range. But not only that, so there's something that seems to be kind of added here, and it seems to be something to do with their very identity. So it looks as though the guardians, now the citizens of the ideal city, they identify really strongly with one another. So there's this kind of weird stuff in there, but here Plato talks about they say mine and not mine about the same thing. They share in pleasures and pains. Again, they have these kind of joint goals. So it looks as though I think that what we get here is, if we think of this telling this normative story of development, we have eventually this picture of what it is to be well-formed. Actually, it goes beyond book 4. So book 4, the well-formed person has harmony in the soul, it's a healthy state, blah, 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 everything that's in your second year course. But here in book 5, it looks like something's added where the well-formed person not only has a kind of unity within themselves, but has this kind of unity with other people. So there's a sense in which, in this developmental narrative, you've got this kind of picture of the self that's kind of expanded, right? And it's a bit wacky, maybe, but you've got this kind of this picture of I think the well-formed person, where in fact their kind of identity is expanded beyond the bounds of their own body, as it were, to kind of identify with other people. So this, I would suggest, is what Plato is presenting as the newly finished person that kind of results from education and nurture, through education, good education and nurture. We have someone who not only has good desires, has a well-formed soul in this way, but who has this kind of, who identifies strongly with other people, has these really strong interpersonal relations, has these good friendships, and this maybe is the kind of locus of flourishing. So I am definitely going to have to speed up. So just kind of going to the narrative of decline and kind of fast forward to book 8. I think that we can now appreciate better various ways in which this narrative kind of mirrors that early developmental narrative, but in the negative. So there's this weird stuff about mixing of metals, it's very weird, I'm just going to kind of leave that, but we're told that the first thing, again, important as a beginning, is the first thing that goes wrong after this is that the kind of people who shouldn't be ruling, they neglect early education. And I take it that just in mentioning this, Plato, we can kind of recall the whole, what would it be to neglect early education? Well, it would be to neglect everything that we got in those early books. So it's kind of shorthand for, go back and read that stuff. So I take it, these citizens are going to hear these kind of EastEnders stories about warring families and so on. They're going to take in these kind of bad attitudes. And actually, we're told then, it's immediately after that civil war breaks out. So again, it can't be kind of, it's not a coincidence that Plato then has this focus on civil war, on the kind of the interpersonal, and there's a move towards privatization immediately in the account, which again seems to kind of mirror that comparative that we had in book 5, which tells us about how kind of good relations are developed through community and so on. So what I'm kind of suggesting is, when we read those earlier books, and now we look at books 8 and then 9, that we're kind of being invited to see through these motifs. Imagine a subject who's kind of on the opposite developmental trajectory to that kind of good case described in the earlier books. So, instead of forming good interpersonal attitudes, instead of learning to cooperate and so on, forming joint goals, identifying with other people, we have someone, who kind of does the opposite, who develops these kind of, who's, habituated to these kind of bad attitudes from an early age, who kind of grows up in this kind of culture of privatization and this question of what do we think would kind of happen in that kind of culture. And I think that this is actually what we then get when we come to the tyrant. Okay, so to go through this very quickly here again, I just love to, there's so many wonderful texts here that I really love to dwell on. But we see someone who, contrary to the Guardians, who don't take their friendship lightly, etc. He does take his, whatever friendships he might have, lightly. So we've got these passages where we're told that he kind of sacrifices his parents, his oldest Philia, for, let's say, just a newfound, replaceable lover, etc. He makes these gestures of friendship. This isn't taking this seriously. And he did this thought that once he gets what he wants, others become strangers to him. Again, I think this image of him enslaving his parents is obviously the kind of converse of guarding. So if you think that guarding is kind of subordinating yourself to the interests of, upholding the interests of another, enslaving is you subordinate another to yourself. He's obviously, in terms of his soul, he's got this kind of civil war. He's not got philia between the parts of his soul as the just person does. He's got this kind of stasis instead. And I think, interestingly, it looks as though, there's no kind of smoking gun text here, but his very identity kind of seems to have contracted to a point. So if it looks like you've got that kind of account of how you've got this kind of expanded sense of identity, kind of the communal identity, here it really seems, almost, maybe we could talk about this in the Q&A, I just got this sense that the tyrant barely exists at all. He's just kind of contracted to this point, this eros, who he's kind of enslaved to, who kind of directs him and everything. And so I want to suggest that this is this picture of what it is, at least in part, to be ill-formed. So, not just to have these unruly desires and kind of be frenzied, etc., but to have these kind of take friendships lightly, to have this really, impoverished relations with other people, and to have this really kind of contracted sense of identity. So I take it because we started 5 minutes earlier. I'll go on and I'll try and get through the last 2 slides in about 5 minutes. So what I kind of want to do to end is just reflect a bit on how the kind of story I'm telling, how this relates to others in the literature, the kind of standard reading of the Tyrant. I'm talking about a rereading of the Republic, a rereading of the tyrannical character. So I think, okay, what does this, how does this relate to those other kinds of explanations that appeal to his characteristic desires and say, well, if you've got these kind of desires, this is why you're friendless. How does my account sit with those? And I hope by now it's clear that this isn't, really a kind of supplementary account to those. So I'm not just simply kind of telling the story of how you get how you get unruly appetites with the result that you're friendless. But I'm suggesting that if we read the Republic, if we go back, reread the Republic with this in view, we kind of see that maybe this suggests a different account of the source of his status as aphilos, the source of his aphilia. So that this lies not principally, at least, in the kind of desires he has, but in his education and developmental history. So the kind of education he's had, the kind of nurture that the tyrant has had, is perhaps, I'm suggesting in the Republic, what's explaining maturity. So we're told this kind of, I was suggesting this developmental narrative tells us a story about actually the development of good interpersonal relations and the different kind of factors there. So it's not simply the case that, oh, he had some bad desires, he had some unruly appetites, so then he's just necessarily going to be friendless. So, and I know, I'm suggesting that we're being told this story about, that the development of interpersonal relationships is an important part, I take it, of how we develop as human beings, and kind of we're told the story about what it is to become well-formed in the good case and kind of ill-formed in the bad case. And as I suggested earlier, this is actually kind of meant to tell us something important about flourishing or the opposite. But this is always the risky bit. We're coming to the end, but I'm just going to push a little bit further and do the risky thing of not play it safe with that, but make a kind of further tentative suggestion and see what you think about this, and if you've got kind of anything further to flesh this out, I'd love to hear your thoughts. So I'm suggesting that the developmental narrative at least tells us that the tyrant isn't, simply aphilos because he's got these bad desires. It tells us, it gives us this kind of different account of the source of his aphilia. But I think that this also kind of, when we reread the Republic in this way, there are now new possibilities that open for thinking about these kind of causal and explanatory relations. And new possibilities for thinking about the relation between his kind of friendlessness, his aphilia, and his characteristic desires. Because I take it in kind of both cases, I know I'm not giving you kind of all the text, but these accounts, if we think that in the developmental narrative that there are some sort of account of how good or bad desires are developed, in each case, this really seems to be kind of prefaced with an account with a distinctly interpersonal focus, right? So in the first case, we just have all of this focus on relationships and the kind of stories we hear before we get to all of the stuff about courage and moderation. And likewise, in the degenerative account, the whole thing begins with this failure of education, with civil war, etc. And then you kind of go on to the democratic oligarchic souls. And again, given the importance in that Plato's emphasis in the Republic again and again on the importance of beginnings, he just emphasizes it at so many crucial points throughout the Republic. It looks as though, this at least opens up the kind of the possibility, we're kind of given this strong impression that actually the development of philia and good interpersonal relations kind of contributes in some way to the development of good desires and good desiderative tendencies. So I take it that this kind of focus and the kind of, especially the order of the narrative that Plato draws attention to, it's not an accident, this isn't a fly-on-the-wall documentary, he wrote this. That this is kind of suggesting that there's something about the development of these kind of interpersonal relations that's actually a condition of the development of good desires, good desiderative tendency, or the opposite. So I guess I'll try and kind of wrap up very quickly. So, again, fuller defense of that would, be for another occasion, but maybe, and this is where I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, what you think might be kind of, if this is true, why do you think this would be, what might be the idea? So some of my thoughts, I take it that, let's say, virtue development takes place in a social context. And I guess that's not kind of merely because, we need educators to be educated, but because, maybe it's within social context, within kind of friendships and the like, that we learn how to kind of modulate our desires, right? How to not take more than your fair share. So that maybe kind of becoming moderate is something that could only really take place in that kind of social context. Maybe there's a thought that like friends and friendships are kind of reasons, not reasons with a capital R, but like are the kind of reasons that a young person could, we're talking about children especially, could respond to if you were explaining why should you not eat, grab that and take, the chocolate bar from, because they're your friend. So perhaps, again, these are some thoughts. I really want to know what you think. So, my kind of ambitious suggestion is this, that actually there's perhaps a suggestion in the Republic that the development of philia and the development of philia, developing good interpersonal relations, is actually a condition of the development of virtue of good science, and contrariwise, that kind of a failure to develop philia, a failure to kind of develop good interpersonal relations, is a kind of a condition, as it were, of vice and the development of bad desires. So to kind of end on let's end with a kind of a punchline. If the standard reading is this thought that the tyrant is aphilos because he's a tyrant, well, my ambitious rereading of the Republic in the kind of theme of this project is that perhaps it's more accurate to say that the tyrant is a tyrant because he's aphilos. And I will end there. And sorry that we kind of hopefully remember that. With that, and then so I don't get barred from entry to the US in this time. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. So yeah, now we'll have 15 minutes of Q&A. And if you could please say your name. So
Yeah, I'd love to actually put like 3D faces. Actually, all I ever see apart from in my class are just blank Zoom screens. So yeah, just 3D faces are wonderful things.
And one more thing, we don't do follow-up questions at Philsoc. So yeah, go ahead.
I'm Sam.
You're sorry?
Sam.
Hi, Sam.
Thank you for the lecture, very interesting. I was thinking about the importance of property for sort of forming virtue, because it wasn't just the fact that you have privatization that was mentioned in terms of how, well, and with that comes individualization of society, because all of the material entities of society are being individualized and put into individual possession. And so there's a move away from that sort of collective spirit, and with that away from seeing yourself and other people, which then leads into aphilos and sort of tyranny. And also there's slavery as well, because it mentioned how people who want your friends you've become master of, and they would essentially become your slaves. And so that in itself instills a sense of property relations over people in that society. And that ultimately does come down, I think, to property relations. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on in terms of how does property sort of mix in with education as a reading of what then contributes to a formulation of virtue.
Great, thank you. Excellent question. And in a sense, you're kind of you've really latched onto one of the themes of Book 5. So Plato, through Socrates and the interlocutors, part of the kind of communal arrangements of the ideal city are that private property is banished, at least amongst the guardian and the auxiliary class. So I take it that he thinks that property and private property is that's kind of one of these elements of kind of privatization that is it is explicitly earlier in kind of books 2 and 3, I forget which one, this kind of privatization and private property is linked with kind of enmity and hostility and so on. And then this is how this kind of all gets picked up in Book 5, when they say, hang on a second, you said banish private property, what? And then we get this account of the kind of communal arrangement. So I take it that there is this thought that privatisation, including private property, is something that is kind of conducive to, let's say, hostility, enmity, etc. Whereas kind of communal ownership, as it were, is something that's more conducive to, let's say, everything is common amongst friends. It's a kind of famous Greek phrase, but I think it's kind of intentionally used here. And what I'm suggesting is that I'm kind of drawing attention to the fact that this account of nurture is alongside this. So you might just read this kind of politically, that Plato is just making a political point about private property or something. You could definitely read it like that. And I'm suggesting that as well as this kind of political point that's kind of quite familiar in the Republic, that actually we can see that we've got this account of nurture that's kind of embedded in this discussion. So I take it that the kind of the very general thought is that that's one element of a kind of a culture or something that is one that is kind of conducive to poor interpersonal relations, and kind of not conducive to the development of Philia. So now this kind of starts like a kind of Marxist reading of the Republic. Says she buying a house, but like, yeah, I take it that property is what, I mean, it is one of the features that Plato draws attention to. So you're kind of right to notice that, if that kind of helps answer the question.
Yes.
Ian is the name. I was just an interesting, what do you call it? Consequence, that's it, of if this whole idea of almost learning to do good via Philia, just the sort of constant examples of, don't tell the kids the bad stories from Homer. Do you think that almost implies that instead of just learning good Philia from Homer, they're almost learning through Philia, through the Philia for the characters in the Homeric stories?
So it's not just, so can I just ask you to say, yeah, that I think I'm following the thought, but maybe let me not put words into your mouth. So is it something like this, it's not something simply about relations, but can you say a little bit more about, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot here.
It's almost like, in the same way that in a modern sense, if you read a book, you can have an interpersonal relationship with people who don't exist. And so then in the Homeric stories, the thought would be, they form these interpersonal relationships and they learn the good stuff through Philia, even if it's like it's only a one-sided thing. Achilles doesn't love me, but but you would not just be learn by practice, but you're still doing Philia even when you're learning through Homer.
That's interesting. I guess so. The question is, how would we kind of unpack that? So is the thought, on the spot here, something like we could kind of learn empathy or something through. Would that be a part of? I'm trying to think. Yeah, what would it be to learn? I think it's a really interesting suggestion. So what would that picture look like? So yeah, I wonder maybe something that we can kind of learn to be empathetic or something through empathizing with characters, or am I missing? Is there something kind of deeper that?
No, just one thought of if you're saying empathy, and if you imagine that in the ideal world, I do really good Philia, my sense of selfhood expands. Philia is a kind of like, before I get a wider sense of self, I have to set up some good Philia with you. That's my connection to the Homeric characters is almost like anticipatory of my sense of self expanding. Achilles becomes a part of who I am.
Yeah, that's really nice. I like that. I'll have to kind of think about that a bit more, but I like that as a kind of, so yeah, if we think, there's definitely this thought that, this is all kind of early habituation, and this is, kind of put the quotation, I'm not going to go back, it will take a long time to get there, but the sense of the opinions that we absorb at this time are, they kind of, the soul takes on a certain shape and it becomes unalterable. And so, so there's kind of this kind of almost mimesis, as it were, kind of a first attempt at anticipatory feeling. I like that. I haven't thought about that way, but thank you. Yeah.
To a bit of a long question because I wrote it down. But so, do you think Plato relies on any descriptive claims that can be falsified? So to give an example, Popper, as I'm sure you know, wrote quite extensively about Plato.
He's not a good reader of Plato.
I mean, I was about to say, but I mean, he accused Plato of ontological holism, essentialism, and historicism, which is why, when you argued, all of those were descriptively false. Now, say a psychologist who was prone to empiricism, naturalism, and scientific realism, rather than any form of like hermeneutical parsing of texts, found that dictators and tyrants actually reported higher levels of happiness on any index we currently know. So currently, like the socioeconomic status or social health gradient. My question is, how would you respond? And then second is, ultimately, is there anything that would ever make you doubt Plato's account of the tyrant?
I know, quod erat demonstrandum.
I mean, to briefly explain, say we found out that Mao, Hitler, Pol Pot all actually had delightful interpersonal relations. I don't think they did. But say they did. What would that make you question Plato's claims?
Great question. I mean, I can't really kind of speak to the Popper reading of Plato. I say I don't think he's well, he was definitely not a sympathetic reader, but I don't think he's a kind of very good reader of what Plato is actually up to. I mean, it's hard. So just I don't know if this is going to be satisfactory. You know, there's not going to be a kind of proof satisfactory answer in one sense, but. So one thing I just find so wonderful about the Republic is so this was written 2,500 years ago, right? And there just seems to be something that rings so true still. In fact, in some ways, the account of the kind of degenerate souls maybe are even more resonant than the account of justice. I mean, you know, justice is all very nice. That's helping the soul, great. But actually, these descriptions of kind of you know, what it is to be an honour lover, what it is to be an oligarch, and then the democrat, the kind of insatiable desire for freedom, and then tyranny. We can get off this in case I say I don't want, you know, to be stopped at the border at some point. But this is going on YouTube, isn't it? If you come to my office, you'll see my kind of protest poster from a few years ago. Come to office hours. But I suppose I just take it that there's something that kind of still rings descriptively true. And so also with the tyrant, what he's describing, he does say this kind of tyrant character type. This isn't necessarily a ruling tyrant, but he says the worst, the most miserable person is a person who not only has a tyrannical soul, but who has the misfortune to become a tyrant. And this is that in that first quotation, his ruling makes him more, you know, he's miserable, he makes others like himself, and his ruling makes him more so. And I guess, I mean, I don't know if this is just kind of, you know, rhetoric, just trying to, I guess I'm never going to, you know, I'm never going to persuade Popper, and I don't think I'm in the business of kind of trying to find, you know, have a falsifiable kind of theory or something. So I suppose to just say, you know, it looks like there are some figures that just don't seem to have friends. And it's not simply because they've acted like assholes, right? That there seem to be some sorts of people, not necessarily political rulers, but who seem not to have kind of these, who seem to be incapable of having what we want to call, you know, real friendships, not relationships with people. Lots of people are flatterers, right? And people who are willing to obey them in everything. But these kind of relationships where I say you have this kind of, you identify with other people, you form joint goals, you cooperate, etc., etc. You have this kind of expanded picture, and so actually, you know, I'll move on. You know, it's not the kind of political point. I'm not kind of doing it to point to a particular person that's like it, but I take it that it is a kind of a familiar picture. And if there's a question about, well, you know, in the Republic, what is it to be? One question, one of the main questions, you know, what's the topic of the Republic? Loads of things, but one thing we might think it's about is what it is to be well-formed as the kind of beings that we are, and the kind of, you know, other side of that coin, what is it to be ill-formed? And I take it that, you know, there's a thought here, I've suggested that it's not nice not to, you know, if you're a jerk, you'll lose your friends and you'll be kind of alienated, and yeah, that's bad. But actually, we kind of think that there's something pathological about not having and developing good relations with other people, and there's something that's kind of part of what it is to be well formed is to relate well to other people. So sorry, that's kind of, I don't know, you know, that's not giving. I'm not sure what to say about falsifiability. I guess I just point to the idea that, you know, here 2,500 years, we're here in 2021, and Plato has described something that's still so familiar, and maybe that's just what I'd say to Popper, and also read the Republic, Popper. Thank you for the question.
Yes.
Hi, my name's Duncan. This is kind of just to check whether I understood kind of question rather than something deep, because I've not read philosophy for a while. But you were talking about, just in that response, the difference that Plato draws between the private tyrant, so somebody who has a tyrannical kind of character, and then the tyrant that goes on to actually achieve power, which is when it perhaps matters more to other people. And I wondered whether part of the point that you were making in the lecture was that that's kind of a developmental step, is the acquisition of power, and yet you can see that the tyrannical qualities that left this person friendless or aphilos hasn't changed at that point. And so you're kind of drawn to look further back in the development, and you in particular don't want to go quite back to sort of their outset. It's not that they were born with this characteristic. There must have been something that led to the qualities of character that mean that they're friendless. Am I right in thinking that you're saying that that's a matter of their upbringing, the guardianship to which they're exposed, and that it's that development that leads both to them becoming potentially a kind of powerful tyrant, but also that leads to the friendlessness? It's not an innate thing, it's somewhere there in the kind of developmental stage, but before the point at which you're deciding between types of ruler, it really is the type of character that we get to that stage.
Thank you for an excellent question. So just to embarrass this is one of my oldest Philoi from school, who is a graduate of St Andrew's Philosophy and lifetime member of Phil Sox, who happened to be in town this week and have to put up with me as the speaker. So I want to, I guess, so I at least want to say education and nurture, maybe kind of rolling back a little bit, are kind of, at the very least, contributing causes. So I want to kind of push on the idea that there's something simply just in the nature of that kind of essentialism, something in the nature of some certain people. I mean, there might be some of that. There are elements that you know, that might be there, but I want to say that Plato's kind of putting this emphasis on education and nurture. Now, with the kind of the move from someone with a tyrannical character to someone who actually becomes a tyrant, I mean, one sense in which you could see that as almost a kind of later, that's if we're talking about something developmental, then that's the actual kind of extreme. So kind of rolling back a step, I take it with the tyrant there's something kind of iterative about this. So, you know, we've got the education and nurture, and then the account, we have the way in which he interacts with other people. You know, that seems to, he enslaves his parents, and, you know, then he has this chance to kind of, he makes, you know, he needs things, he makes gestures of friendship, and then they become, you know, strangers again. So you might think that even in that account we're getting this kind of sense of, as well as the education and nurture, in terms of ongoing practice, a kind of iterative process through which his relations are deteriorating. So then that moved to kind of becoming an actual type, you know, having the fortune to come into power. I suppose there's a way, I'm not sure if this is answering the question or not. I suppose I see that as, again, just the kind of real end point of this, you know, what would the very end of this trajectory be like? So instead of kind of guarding other people as we get, you know, the philosopher rulers and the guardians of the ideal city, well, you tyrannize, you enslave others, and then maybe you might think that, so why does his ruling make him more like this? Well, yeah, maybe there is something about them being in that relation of, you know, master to slave that again kind of feeds into this. So this is where I think it's interesting, what is it that happens? Maybe there's a kind of feedback loop or something that kind of happens. So in the course of his tyrannical life, just someone with a tyrannical character, I guess I'm suggesting we've not necessarily got a kind of finished product, as it were. It could get even worse. You can live this life, and this life can make things even worse, and your relationships can deteriorate. And the way in which things could get even worse is if you become a master to a slave, and then you're really isolated, and maybe that's going to feed into kind of that friendlessness even more. So, I mean, I suppose, I actually think there's a kind of a dynamic relation between the aphilia and the bad desires. So that also then, once you've got these desires, you're going to behaviour that is incompatible with philia, and then that's going to give you the kind of, you're going to become more alienated, and then that's going to feed back in a kind of negative way. So I don't know if that. Hello.
Sorry, put you on the book till 9 o'clock.
Yeah.
I think we're wrapping up. We just had some technical issues.
All right.
We're about to end.
I'll hang away.
Okay. I think that might be
Our cue.
I'm gonna get told off.
We are going to the pub after this, so if you have any more questions, maybe, I don't know if you want to come along, but
I will.
Phil Sock is going to the pub. But yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your excellent questions.